Welcome back to the Red Web. I'm your host, Brad West, where we talk about the culture of superheroes and its impact on the world. Tonight's episode, we're going to be talking about the progression in time. Today is my birthday, and since I've got Peter Pan syndrome and I'm never going to grow old, like Peter Parker, we wanted to talk about how time works in comic books. It's a unique thing to comic books that they have to stretch time out over a period of time, but somehow also compress it. And it can be confusing to readers. It can be confusing to writers and creators. But we're going to talk about some of the reasons that it's a problem and some of the ways that they get around it. Today, my guests are my friend Martin Figueroa. He's a photographer and artist, and you can find him at the_broken_robot on Instagram and check out his photography if you want to get a hold of him. And of course, my husband Bo, who we are with the Heroes of Texas volunteer organization that does costuming and superhero appearances for kids and stuff. We just wrapped up the 10th annual Casa Superhero 5K, which was amazing. I'm not sure when our next thing is going to be, but
the next one I know of is on the 29th of October. I think there's one before that, but I don't know for sure.
We do have a Halloween Comic Fest that we're going to be doing with Dell Children's Hospital, and I think we're going to be at Dragon's Lair Comics and Games on the 26th for their Halloween party. So maybe come and check us out and talk to us there. So time in comic books. Now, what is the problem with time in comic books? Oh, yes. So, guys.
Problem of time in comic books. It's the characters don't age. You've had Peter Parker, you've had Superman, Batman, all these characters, they have been the same characters for years, or rather, the heroes have had the same secret identities for years. You know, I mean, you have characters like Nick Fury, from the original Nick Fury, even going on to the current Nick Fury. You have Batman has been Bruce Wayne forever.
Well,
you know.
Why don't they grow up and get older like everybody else in any other story?
I mean, it's one, just writing and our love for the characters, which I kind of don't mind, although touching on some later topics, because we do have characters that eventually end up growing, end up doing all that fun stuff that we get to see, and just those little character development moments.
Yeah, well, so that's
it also gets confusing though.
It does.
Because look at, using Batman as an example again, look at Batman and Nightwing, Bruce and Dick. When they started, Bruce Wayne was roughly in his 30s. Dick Grayson was what, a teenager?
Not even
a teenager. No. Yeah, he didn't even have a license to drive yet. And then now Bruce Wayne is still roughly in his 30s, and Dick Grayson is, well, almost in his 30s.
He's 20-something. He's roughly,
but
he's on the
Batman has, Batman. Well, I don't know. Did they sneak him some Infinity Formula?
No, maybe. Yeah. So the basic problem we have is that for our love for the characters and also money, the publishers want to draw out their marketable characters as long as possible. So they have to keep these characters going, and this does create a lot of problems, a lot of incongruencies within the stories. This is a completely unique thing to comic books, print comic books specifically, because we have something that is specifically moving along in real time, but being held accountable for its progression. Books are frozen. They're frozen in the time period that they're done. They may come along later on and rewrite or update the book, but the book is pretty much stuck. Television, it has to progress with the actors and the creators who do it most of the time. For instance, right now, as this contracts and contrasts with other literary media, especially superhero appearances, we have the MCU as a great example of why. I mean, it's just by contrasting, you really see the problem. MCU now, the actors get bored, grow old, directors, things move on, so Captain America retires. Characters have to die. Comic books, they don't have to die. They can always come back. They don't have to grow old. So this is a good and bad thing. We get our characters and our stories for lasting a lot longer. Mm-hmm. But it also it keeps us away from getting the pleasure of seeing them grow up, seeing them have those life moments. And then what happens when we do have those life moments and stuff, and they're in there and they're unavoidable? They're like, talk about like super elephants in the room all the time. These are some really big things that are unique to this particular thing. I mean, it's kind of like a soap opera, but even in soap operas, you know, the actors have to grow old and get off the show, you know. So, what are the main things that make this really stand out from other things? And I really had to stop and think and look and research and try and figure out how to narrow it down. What are the things that writers and creators within comic books have to work around specifically to help the progression of time become relatively believable in comics? And what I came down to were topical references and factual references. Things that sort of, you know, add to the story, things that happen, the past, you know, leads you to the future. You have events that are...
for instance, the Thing having interacted with Nixon, President Nixon, for instance. At the time, it would have been considered factual. Now it's more of a topical reference, whereas apparently Deadpool interacts with Richard Nixon's zombie, which is considered factual.
Well, yeah.
Ish.
And that's one
Gray
of the,
area.
and that's one of the problems that Marvel specifically starts addressing it. DC didn't have to address it quite the same. The thing with DC Comics historically is that when they were in the height of their original, what is known as the golden age of comic books, they were kind of, you know, everybody was publishing, everything was factual at the time. Everything was congruent with real time. Everything that was going on was touching on the World War II and social issues of the day and such. But then, because comic books were a new medium and they started to fall off in favor, kind of nobody cared. Like, it was really no big deal. It wasn't until Marvel came along in the 60s and started bringing back the passion and the interest in comics again. And DC did the first time, this is the first time that they ever did it, but they didn't do it on purpose. This is what you got to understand, is they rebooted their universe. And it wasn't so much a reboot as they're like, okay, well, let's just go back and get these ideas and start them over from scratch. So that's kind of one way that they deal with it, is a reboot. Eventually, they do merge it into their previous continuity, whereas both existed at the same time. Then you get a lot of back and forth and mix and match until you get to other reboots. But a lot of this is really kind of Marvel bringing it on.
Absolutely. And sometimes I just thought of this when reading comics and then being disconnected a little bit. Sometimes when they try to tie in those things, it feels like a fanfic of a fanfic of a fanfic. And
It
then
does.
just bringing
right.
in those other things. And it just clicked in my head. I was like, oh, I mean, with everything that's happened with Dick Grayson, Red Hood, and all that, it's like, oh, cool. I love that they're adding new people, but also I'm kind of reading comic fanfic.
Right.
But like big artists, obviously.
Marvel first started noticing this when by the 80s. You'd already had, like I said, in the 60s, it wasn't really a big deal. They threw in what was happening, you know. The Fantastic Four, they were inspired to beat the Soviets into space. But, you know, as time went by and the Soviets made it into space, you know, they changed it to where they were, you know, following in their footsteps instead. And, you know, one of the things that I was looking at, but the Fantastic Four is a really great one for this because it is the focal point that Marvel will eventually come to use for what they consider their definitive timeline. But, you know, the Fantastic Four, everybody knows, cosmic radiation. And then you have to think to yourself, well, now so many people have been in space. Well, why didn't everybody that goes to space mutate by cosmic radiation?
Yeah.
You know, so that wasn't a consideration at the beginning. Now that's something that they had to add into that. So one of the ways that they go around this is, I narrowed it down to reboots and retcons. Now, the retcon for instance, Fantastic Four is they went in, for those of you who are not, you know, super into the comic book lingo, reboots and retcons. Retcon means retroactive continuity, and we have probably discussed it on the show at least once or twice before. Retroactive continuity means that after the fact, they go back within the story and add a different element to the narrative that previously had never been revealed.
Right. So Fantastic Four originally trying to win the space race, not so much anymore. Now they are just another group of scientists that ended up in a mishap in space. You know, it's not so much they were the daring trying to beat, but now it's just, like I said.
What are some of the better retcons that have been used specifically to stretch out the timelines?
Well, so like we were discussing earlier, Nick Fury and Iron Man, because both of them get their starts in the wars. Nick Fury originally was a World War II hero. He was a World War II vet. So he actually fought alongside Captain America before Captain America went into the ice. Well, eventually they retconned it to where he was a Vietnam vet.
And
So
it was his father.
it was his father who fought alongside.
Like Rick Fury or something?
Yeah,
They
something.
changed
Yeah, it was like
No, I'm not kidding. There was like another Fury guy.
I absolutely believe it.
But that's how they kept it relevant. He was still a war hero, and even with the Infinity Serum, he's older
we'll get
than he
back to.
looks. Right, he's older than he looks, but he's still a war vet. But he's not a contemporary of Captain America's. Now he's someone who his dad talked about Captain America while he was growing up, and then he volunteered for the Vietnam War because of being inspired by Captain America.
Martin, your favorite retcon?
So my favorite, kind of on that same touch, is with my favorite Lantern, John Stewart. They've moved him from the Vietnam War to things a bit more currently, and I think I could be mistaken. They retconned him to I think the Gulf War or something crazy like that, and just with him and his backstory is just kind of beautiful, and I love it, and he's just amazing.
It was interesting. It was brought up before the show when we were brainstorming that it is kind of a little bit interesting. We'll say interesting that that they always have a war to focus on.
Yeah.
For
within
that
recent
happened
memory.
It's
true.
always easy to update your characters that have a war story origin, because
when you're
you
talking
got
about
Vietnam to
there's
the
always a
Gulf
new
War
war.
to
Yeah. Main problems with retroactive continuity retcon.
Just confusion. I've kind of not been as attached to comics as I was recently, and trying to jump back in and just oh, they changed this minor thing, this thing happened. It's oh, I didn't realize this changed.
That's one of the funny things about retroactive continuity in comic books is that yes, that is a it's something that they really need to use sparingly because
Absolutely.
they take advantage of it way too much. It's something that's great. It's great that it's a thing that is unique that they can use, but at the same time, it's very alienating. And you have a lot of back and forth within the comic book community as to the value of story elements that are retcon.
Well, for instance, you have those people like myself who have been reading comic books for a while, and you have I don't want to say kids, but our friend Brandon's a great example. He's considerable. Well, I'm not going to say considerably. He's younger than we are. And, the origin stories, we've talked about a couple of stuff, and, he'll correct me on an origin story, and it's oh, that's the new one. Got it.
Well, and that's the thing. It's you have a lot of you have some of the fans who are and don't worry about it. Don't focus on that. A lot of times when we were saying one of the big things to remember with this is just roll with it. Sometimes just enjoy the story and just roll with it. But other times, you kind of miss out on the fact that's what people like about it to begin with. You can't just completely discount continuity because that's kind of the fun of comic books for a lot of people, is that you do have this rich history that is continued through, and that you do have these elements that add to the depth of the story.
Now talking retcon versus reboots, though. So trying to veer away from the retconning, but using the X-Men as a great example for retconning, the X-Men, your core characters have reached adulthood and have pretty much locked up, but they continue to introduce new characters, younger characters that will eventually start growing up also. But then you switch over to DC, and they don't so much retcon, they use it a little bit, but their big go-to of, enough time has passed, let's reboot. Let's start the whole universe over again. And that's equally as frustrating, because where you're having that conversation of, so-and-so started off doing this. No, they started off doing this. Oh, new information. Well, now you've got a whole, I'll use the 52. I'll use the new 52 as to me what's a good example, because they started doing they gave you your origin stories all over again from scratch, but they're doing that at the same time as they're running stories that happen later in the heroes' careers, and with that they weren't quite as successful as previous reboots because not all of your information was lining up, even within continuity of the own character.
So with reboots, like I said, DC did it on accident the first time. They weren't really intentionally rebooting. Then it came about as a necessity in the 80s with the Crisis on Infinite Earths. This is a very important point in comic book history. Mostly it came down to the fact that DC Comics had gotten too big. It had acquired too many other publications. It didn't know what to do with all of its characters. It was just completely out of hand. And for most comic book historians, it's considered to have been justified. And it was successful, without a doubt.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There were definitely a lot that had problems with it to begin with, but it made so much cleanup. It gave us some of our best artists, our best writers, our best creators, many who are still active in the industry today. And it really did kind of pave the way for what we consider the modern comic book method and system. However, yes, they did eventually decide they were going to try it again. I think the first time was when I was a kid. It was 0 Hour, which was a mess. Actually, it was the first time it started off as a mess. Green Lantern was a villain, and Green Lantern destroyed the world, and they had to start it over again. And that was the next one.
Hal Jordan is responsible for that one.
He got all the rings. He was or they retconned it.
No, that didn't come until the retcon.
That didn't come until the retcon.
No.
Originally,
he really was crazy.
He went crazy.
He really was crazy evil.
He went mad with grief.
That. Yes.
He legitimately went mad with grief, which I thought was a great story.
We're not going to spoil that, but within context, it's actually pretty awesome. But yeah,
I appreciate that you knew where my brain was at.
Yes.
So it was just like
I said, DC uses retcon also.
DC does that, but then they do the reboots, and then we get to they did it once before way before
between 0 Hour
52.
and New 52,
and
oh Lord,
I don't think that was the Infinite Crisis. I think is what it was. I don't know. I wasn't
that
really
was before my time.
Yeah, I really wasn't reading that one so much. I really wasn't reading that one so much either. But yeah, then they get to New 52, which it meant. I don't know. That was pretty much the.
But that led into your current story arc also right now, where I love how
it's not a reboot.
It's not a reboot because 52 was not as well received as they had hoped. They had some great stories come out of it, but it was not. The current. I'm going to try and be spoiler free. The current Shazam movie comes from 52 source.
Yes.
The new 52
and that's a great
Aquaman
movie.
was pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love the new 52 Aquaman. The new 52 Green Lantern doesn't really matter because they didn't reboot anything.
I think that was actually.
I have hope.
That was the failure of the new 52.
Exactly. They rebooted this, but they didn't reboot that, and it was still in continuity.
If they had gone all in and rebooted it, then I think it would have been successful.
But that's what leads you into their current story, which I love. Because now you've got the Doomsday Clock.
Yeah.
And this is them,
reboot.
This is a soft reboot. This is them cleaning up the 52. And I love it because, again, trying to be spoiler free, Dr. Manhattan's the bad guy.
Okay, that was as spoiler as it gets, baby.
I mean, not really, because there's a lot of. Yeah, that's in the promo art. So, and if you didn't know that, you just stopped paying attention.
Because we're talking about the progression of time. New 52 is a really good example of how this is a difficult trope to manage.
Yes.
Specifically, noting how they, like I said, they needed to either go all in or forget it, and they were trying to cherry pick. And what happened is, you have Superman is new on the scene. Wonder Woman is new on the scene. You know, they've all been around for about 5 years, right? And so is Batman and Green Lantern. Well, because Batman and Green Lantern were two of the books that were selling the best, those are the ones they didn't change. So when everything else rebooted, their continuity kind of stayed the same. So now all of a sudden, Superman's been on the scene for 5 years, Batman's been on the scene for about 5 years, but now he's into his fourth Robin already.
Yeah.
You know, Dick Grayson managed to grow up from the Boy Wonder into Nightwing in less than 4 years, and then 3 other Robins came along after him. So that's kind of where we're talking about how this gets really, really difficult. I like to refer to a reboot as a joke with no punchline. The problem with this is that a lot of times when you're reading a story, you want to follow the natural story structure.
Beginning, middle, end.
I mean, a beginning, a middle, and end. And while individual stories within them are fine, and they have their endings and their satisfaction and completion, when you are in a universe, you want to kind of have a feeling of closure, and there's no closure. Even MCU, if they stopped right after Endgame, there was at least closure. And the comic books, you don't have that. And so when you reboot in the middle of stories, in the middle of a world, time, it gives you, it's frustrating. It's frustrating is the ultimate
now,
thing.
I will give them, I loved how they handled it in, oh Lord, the ambush bug. Doom Patrol.
Doom Patrol?
I loved how they handled it in Doom Patrol because they were literally in the middle of a story arc when the reboot happened.
Yes.
And so they weren't going to get a chance to finish that story. And so Ambush Bug shows up and he's going, okay, we might as well just cut this short. And he whispers in the bad guy's ear what's going on. And the bad guy, I love it, is going, what's a
Dedeo.
What's a Dedeo? Really? We're not even... All right, I'm done. We're going home.
No, literally, the bad guys just give up because they know the universe is getting rebooted and there's no reason to continue fighting.
Wait, is Ambush Bug the dude green like?
Yeah, the
Yes.
green sock with the...
Yes.
He
the
actually
antennas.
was one of the first characters to pull the whole,
Breaking the fourth wall.
trope that everybody attributes to Deadpool. It's one of the many things that Liefeld stole. Anyway, so...
We're not talking about that.
I know. So, when it comes to reboots and retcons and stuff and the frustration, there are different ways that comic books address, and the creators have gotten creative to finish some of those things. Like I said, you don't get the sense of completion. So a lot of really amazing miniseries and limited series have come out of writers and creators wanting to create something that does exactly that. Marvel has
two of my favorite series.
Marvel periodically will produce a series called The End. And they've actually done an X-Men The End and a couple of other ones.
Two of my favorite series in that vein, you have Marvel's X-Men Forever, because it picks up off of some of Chris Claremont's stories and just goes from there, giving you more of a natural progression for those X-Men characters.
Really
and
cool.
then there was a series in late 90s, early 2000s, I think, in DC called Generations, where all your superheroes grew old. Well, the ones that survived.
It was basically what if
But
the original
they're-
the original Superman and Batman from the 40s kept aging in real time with the rest of the world, and so each issue was the next generation.
So
of
Dick
those
Grayson
characters.
eventually became Batman. He ended up with his own Robin,
One of Superman's descendants married one of Batman's descendants, and they started having the next Batmans and Supermans.
Yeah,
and,
That's adorable.
Yeah, no, it was a great story.
Supergirls and such as that.
I loved that story. But yeah, it's one of those, it's a miniseries because you do get that beginning, the middle, and the end, and you get see a natural progression. And yeah, you don't, unfortunately, it's just not something you get to get.
I know you
in
were saying one of
comics.
your favorite parts was Superman.
Superman, yes. Because they actually address the fact that Superman ages slower than a normal human. And so as Clark Kent, he started wearing makeup and graying his hair and everything so that Clark would age. But then when he would turn into Superman, basically all the makeup and everything would just kind of strip away because he would fly at super speed. But
'Cause
Superman stayed
Right.
ageless because Superman, And I enjoyed that aspect. Yes, Superman was still young in an appearance, but there was a reason for that. Whereas everyone else, they aged. They eventually moved on.
So I have something new to go back to.
Oh.
Or new for me. 'Cause I haven't heard it. That's super awesome.
It's a cool series.
Yeah.
They've also both done a lot.
Good luck finding it.
It's not hard to find.
Really? I can never find
I
it.
found it on Amazon.
Of
It's on
course you
Amazon.
did.
Amazon has everything.
It's also fun. They will periodically produce alternate futures. A lot of really good storylines have come about.
Well, you were saying something about Justice League.
Oh, we haven't really.
Oh,
talked about
am
that.
I getting ahead of us? Sorry.
Yeah, that's back
It's
onto,
that whole progression of time thing.
Well, yeah. To adjust seeing this characters to the completion, there's a lot of comic books that have future storylines, which I think is kind of amusing, especially considering the number of future storylines both Marvel, DC, and even some of the other publications have come out with that will never come, or things that were set in the future that we've already
That had long since passed.
that we've already passed up. I mean, 2099 Marvel characters. I mean, that's good on you, Marvel, for at least putting it far enough ahead.
Yeah.
But like
There's still hope we'll have a
there's hope,
flying car before then.
Yeah, but one of my favorite series that I loved from the 90s was called Armageddon 2001. In which, in a dystopian future of 2001, some superhero went crazy and dominated the world and created a time machine that created this time traveling being that came back with the ability to read people's minds to try and determine who was going to be, and there was this big mystery of who it was going to be, and I won't spoil that one for you. But needless to say, 2001 is come and gone. A couple, so. Then there's even been a few series that were set in, the Mayan calendar 2012, which has passed, and it keeps going back and back, and that kind of thing. It's like Terminator, where it's like, shouldn't Judgment Day have already happened by now? Why is there another
3
movie
times.
coming out? Like,
It's
why?
already happened 3 times.
I know.
Back to the Future, when they end up in the future, what year was it?
No, they never.
2019.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, that was like last year. It was last year or the year before because they
I
actually.
think it was 2017.
Oh, right.
No,
Yeah.
2015. It was
2015.
2015.
You're right.
Because they
There
went
you go.
exactly from 85 back to 55 and then back to 2015.
Yeah.
It was 20 years each direction.
Yep.
But yeah, there was like that's another thing. But you get the point. But we have those hats.
Yeah, I don't
now.
have a self-fitting jacket.
I mean, I was thinking
I
of
do
the
'cause I get
one.
into it.
It's not the same.
I just watched the movie too. It'll pop back in my head later. I have it in my head. I just can't think of it.
Some of the better ones though, and one that's like gotten a lot of recent attention because they've gone back and produced it as an animated film, The Dark Knight Returns.
Yes.
Written in the 80s, it was a alternate future which is already passed. Which is why they produced it in the movie because it was set in the timeline that was kind of an ironic thing. But that time that movie came out, that's when that was supposed to have been set. That he was old Batman.
Right.
Kingdom Come is another really fun one that I really enjoy.
I love Kingdom
that
Come.
was set in a future that I don't think is quite passionate. I'll have to, and that's another thing, and it's a cool.
Put it in the
topic.
comments on YouTube for us.
Yeah, so I'm gonna come back to that too. That's one of the ones where they started getting a clue and started vaguing things. Another really, really amazing Marvel series that I loved very much in a future where you get a lot of closure and you get to see where characters go is the X series. It's Earth
X to Universe X.
Universe X, and then Paradise X.
Yeah,
And
I love that story.
It's really cool. It was very ambitious. It was Marvel's answer to Kingdom Come.
Funny story. You know where that came from?
Which part?
Where the initial idea came from. Someone asked, I think it was
Alex Ross.
to just draw up a picture of Spider-Man older. And so the original artwork that kind of sparked the overarching idea was a picture of Peter having put on a little weight in the Spider-Man suit and everything. He's in the attic trying it on. And, that's kind of where that story, which is great because they actually used that picture in the actual books later on.
Ooh,
But
Yeah.
that picture came out years before the book did.
Yeah, Earth X, Universe X is really cool. I liked that one because they had taken all of the various elements over the many, many years of time of Marvel publication from many different creators, and they brought them together and connected them in a way that had never been done before. And you actually kind of it was something somebody said to me recently about the Dark Crystal series. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it's that this was Saturday at my birthday party. A friend was telling me that they loved the Dark Crystal series, but you already know where it's going. You know what's going to happen. And it's not so much spoilers, but you know what's got to happen. And
Right.
it's really hard to get invested in something that you know the ending of.
Well, you know, the Dark Crystal TV series, as much as Smallville, the things I enjoyed about it isn't, yes, you know where it's going. You know what's going to happen. Lex and Clark aren't always going to be friends like they were in the TV series, but it's the journey
It's the
of
journey, yes.
how you got there. That's what made me enjoy it is, you know, watch the Dark Crystal.
However, with comic books, you never get there. The alternate futures are possible, but they're never actually going to be the actual future. No matter how many times they time travel into the future, or whoever comes back from the future, that's a possible future, and it's always going to be a possible
You know
future.
what? I will say there is one exception to that.
I love that.
The X-Men.
Oh,
Your first class X-Men travel to the future. It will still be their future. They had to send them back to their time period where they came from.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden they like reappear like a year older, and nobody notices. But whatever.
I was gonna say the same with the Flash
They
series.
actually sent them back because they address it because when they sent them back to stay, all of their memories merged with the modern counterparts. So if you haven't read this,
so
I'm sorry,
we're talking
spoilers.
about the progression of time and not time travel. So we're going to move on to other things. So what was you were saying about the
I was
TV?
gonna
the
say
Flash TV.
the Flash show does the same thing. They've alluded to, I don't know if you've watched it, alluded to the series and just like, oh, this thing is gonna happen, and slowly it's been happening because I mean, kind of the same what
Right.
you touched on earlier. Characters are aging up and they want to do other stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things we talked about earlier, and I'm going to connect this to television and other media, was topical elements of characters' personal histories. The aforementioned Crisis on Infinite Earths actually had a lot of major consequences across the board narratively. There was some really interesting characters. One of the main edicts that DC had was that Superman be the only Kryptonian again. So therefore, there was no longer Supergirl or Superdog or anything. It was straight up Superman and Superman only. So that changed the course of a lot of stories up until like the 2000s. And another one was, and this is in the vein of Robin becoming Nightwing, the Flash, Barry Allen, died.
Yes.
And it's interesting to note that in '85, he'd only been in comics for about 20 some odd years, 21 years, right?
Yeah.
From like 63, 22 years. And he'd been the Flash, and his protege, Wally West, had taken over for him as the new Flash. So from '85 on, Wally West was the Flash. That's the Flash I read. My name West, so I liked Wally West Flash. And when we get around to the Justice League animated series, actually even before that, the '90s, when he first appears on Superman animated series spinoff of the Batman animated series, the Bruce Timm universe, the first Bruce Timm Flash is vague. They don't say who he is for sure. Could have been Barry, could have been Wally. And then they get around to using him again in the Justice League series.
Yes.
And Wally West was still the Flash in the comic books. So Wally West was who they went with.
Except for they used, when they went to the couple of stories where they did the civilian ID, they used Barry's
job. They used elements of Barry Allen in it. They did. And so this is a really good point that you brought up about, how the characters, what happens in the comics affects the other medium.
Yes. Even going back to the old Batman series, having Harley Quinn in there, having her in there also translated to her popularity in the comics and bringing her to life.
And she wasn't even really a character for up
Correct.
until that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jon Stewart, like you were saying earlier, Jon Stewart, in a very modern move, the Bruce Timm universe used the Black Green Lantern,
Yes.
who had already been established in the comic books, and they used his more. They made him more into contrast with the youthful Wally West. Even though he did have a military background, they really brought that to the forefront. When they get to the comic books,
I would like to point out.
Too.
When they originally introduced Green Lantern in the Bruce Timm universe, it was Kyle.
It was, and Kyle still existed,
and he still existed. But when the very first episode with a Green Lantern was Kyle. Now, Hal did get a shout out because Kyle got thrown into Hal's jet, but it was Kyle. Then when they did the Justice League animated show, they used Jon Stewart, but Kyle had a very, very brief cameo when John wanted to get stationed on Oa and the Guardians are going, no. And you've got Kyle in the background going, I want to go home.
And they even gave a shout out to Alan Scott, which is a super cool and super deep cut.
Yeah.
So,
but that goes again to the comic books. They have to move through time, and these other elements, the other offshoots, don't. So now we brought Barry Allen back. And so by the time we get around to the TV series, Barry Allen's the main Flash, and so Barry Allen's in the TV series. In the old animated series, Hal Jordan was dead and evil, and so using Jon Stewart was quite fine anyway. And then by the time we get to
Guy still got no love, but he never does.
By the time we get to making a Green Lantern movie, Hal Jordan's back in prominence in the comic book, so they use the Hal Jordan version in that, which is why a lot of people are like, why is this like Hal Jordan? Like, my uncle even asked me this one time where I think we were someplace, and because Bo loves Green Lanterns, and my uncle's like,
no,
that's Green Lantern? I thought Green Lantern was a black guy.
No,
he is.
No, we had to explain that because a little kid came up to me going, you can't be Green Lantern. Green Lantern's
No, that was a whole nother time.
And that's when it came up with Dominic, and we had to explain it.
But so
there's so many different Green Lanterns.
so many.
And I kind of love it. But I lean towards the Blue Lantern Corps. They got the Hope stuff.
All right, we're not even gonna.
It's a whole thing.
That's another whole thing. Yeah, we're talking time. There's no time lanterns. So some other fun ways that they get around this. Marvel had a couple of very unique solutions. One of these were congruent universes. So rather than take the reboot angle that DC was doing, they're like, okay, let's reboot. We're gonna have our cake and eat it too. We're gonna reboot, but we're gonna keep the other one going anyway. And we're gonna start this one over here, and they're gonna run at the same time, parallel to each other. And we had what was called the Ultimate Universe. In fact, rewind even further back to the 90s, they even kind of softly tried that with what was called the Heroes Reborn universe. This was an interesting comic book era where Thor had glam rock hair and wore a crop top, and I mean there was like
it wasn't pretty.
There was so much madness. But basically, what had happened. Okay, wait, I'm gonna try and get this right. Magneto's psyche infected Professor X, and
Professor X emptied out Magneto's mind. Magneto's psyche, yes, infected Professor X, not creating but liberating the dark side of Xavier's mind, creating the villainous Onslaught.
Basically forming substance. So basically, Magneto's evilest parts and Professor X's evilest parts had a baby. And turned into like a giant monster thing. Yeah, they had a very massive hate child who went about and was so powerful.
Oh yeah, if you look at Onslaught's armor, it's Magneto.
Okay, cool.
It's evil Magneto. But basically...
Magneto?
Eviler Magneto. Because, no, arguably, remember we were talking about
no, that's true.
Not evil.
That's true.
In a gray area.
It's all a matter of...
and they also...
From a certain point of view.
From a certain... Right.
Thank you, Obi-Wan.
Life's great truth.
Wrong point of view,
but
well, no, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later.
That could be another episode.
Next time.
But anyway, so Onslaught is so powerful that he basically, in order to stop him, the Avengers, the majority of the Avengers, and all the Fantastic Four,
X-Men,
and no, not X-Men.
Yeah.
Actually, the X-Men survive.
No,
Some of the X-Men?
no, because they got shifted over into the Heroes Reborn also. But no, the X-Men were definitely part of it. It was Professor Xavier. Hello.
Well, yeah, but I honestly I remember more of the because their books kept going. Well, anyway,
Franklin Richards.
so half of Marvel's characters die. Only then there's this other universe. You come to find out that Franklin Richards, who is such a powerful mutant and could create realities, created a reality that he hid them in to save their souls, and he had them in this fantasy world of his own where he put his own spin on everything. This was the first congruent universe that Marvel had going, and whether or not it was intended for it to be folded back in is a matter of some debate.
But it eventually was.
But eventually was. However, you had a lot of the quote-unquote superstar artists and writers of the time, some for better, some for worse.
Just let it go. No calling names out on the show.
I promise I would stop that.
I'll scoot off screen if I need to.
But so yeah, you had some really wild stuff happen. Let me tell you about it. So
yeah.
if you ever want to just read something that's just fun and out of place and on its own and containing its own thing, Heroes Reborn universe. It's
another
a wild
example
trip.
of beginning, middle, and end.
Exactly. It really does. The characters have a complete
I don't think it was meant to be a miniseries, but it ended up being one.
Does give you a complete narrative arc, which is actually kind of a fun thing. Until you get to the Ultimate Universe, and this is where I think Marvel had the right idea. They just didn't believe in it enough. They kind of decided, okay, we're going to start this new universe. We want to make it more modern. We want to make it more edgy. Because edgy is always modern, right? Only problem is that it wasn't until it was too late that they decided to start reining in some of their creators. And a lot of that was so
late.
I don't even think edgy is the word. I mean,
No.
you read the Ultimate Universe stuff, haven't you?
A little bit.
Do you know what Ant-Man did to Wasp?
Yeah, we're
not going to say it on TV. No.
No, it's been a minute. I'm talking middle school. That's
Okay,
when,
yeah.
I started
No, I
getting
mean,
into
there
it a
were
little
Well, that's
bit.
why you're here. Because you would have been the age target group for it.
Yeah.
So I was like,
Yeah.
I was just curious if you read it and you know how you felt about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I appreciate that, but I wasn't in too deep because I was like a secret nerd. I would hide my comics and be like, hey.
Well, we all were. We all
Yeah.
were.
I wasn't.
Now I'm just confident.
Yeah, but superheroes can make you do that. But yeah, no. It had some good and bad.
If they'd have caught some of their writers and artists a little sooner, I think it would have had a much better run. But I mean, you've gotten some great impactful stories, though.
Yeah, really.
I mean, Miles Morales,
Well, the Spider-Man was one of the better successes of that particular version.
exceptionally so.
Because of, and again, back on the topic of the progression of time in comic books, they were able to cherry pick from time. So whereas Peter Parker in the main continuity, you have 40 years of stuff going on sprinkled throughout, and it's kind of vague. When did it happen? When did
he's
it happen?
an adult
what happened?
now.
When didn't happen? He grew up. Whatever. They were able to, in the Ultimate Universe, condense that down to the high points. And they didn't have to stumble around. They could skip over the junk, and they just boiled it down to its essence. And you got some amazing stuff, and it paid homage to the original. It was true to the original, but it kind of had its own flavor on it. Some of the other stories and narratives, they did that too. Some of them, they're just going like, oh, well, that's stupid. We're just going to go off the charts. I mean, Cannibal Hulk, okay? That's all I'm going to say. The rest of it doesn't even need to be said on TV. But Cannibal Hulk.
I didn't really care for their whole Thor Asgardian arcs. In the long run, I still don't know, was he crazy or was he actually...
He wasn't.
Okay.
He wasn't.
In the long run, I just couldn't figure that one out.
I don't know. It just makes me think of Terry McGinnis and the whole Batman Beyond thing with what they were doing there, because it was still kind of connected, but you could also see the hints of the old Batcave and things like that, but with a newer, sleeker armor, newer history and things like that.
And that is the fun of, like I was saying earlier, that is the fun of the alternate futures. The alternate futures give us new stories, but at the same time, the satisfaction of wrapping up the old stories.
Yeah.
You saw where Bruce Wayne went.
He had an idea he was going to say.
Just like in an episode of Justice League, I think Unlimited, Jon Stewart finds out he has a kid. So, and he's just like, what?
Yeah, no, where they
It's my favorite
the
thing,
time
yeah.
traveling, where they actually end up in the Batman Beyond future. No, I did love that, and
Cold
John's just
hard
going,
stop,
wait,
just-
what?
Yeah.
And,
But that affects the characters on the other end, and that gets
Yeah.
back to where we know where this is supposed to go,
Yeah.
and even the characters within the story themselves, talk about it's like, are we going to let this direct our future? That's kind of a lot of the question you have in some of these comic books is, what are we going to direct the future? I know a really popular one is the Young Avengers.
I love the Young Avengers.
Scott Lang, his daughter becomes Stature. She becomes a hero in her own right. So a lot of people are going, oh, Cassie's in the movie. She's got to become Stature. And she's got to become a hero too.
And
And she may well.
with the
out of the
launching of WandaVision. Tell me that's not the actual name,
That is
please.
the actual name.
But with the
Trust me.
launching of WandaVision,
Yeah.
they're talking about having Wiccan, which of course brings me to one question because they're focused on, hey, we're going to have Wiccan. What about his brother Speed?
Oh, I'm sure they'll have him too, but
They've yet to mention him in anything.
he's just a
I don't know. I'm
male
still
and nobody-
salty about what's his name that died in the robot one.
Vision.
No, not Vision. The other dude.
The other robot?
Speed guy.
Quicksilver.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know why I couldn't think of his name, but yes.
Oh, Quicksilver dying in the MCU.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
Well,
like, it's
now
a
that
wasted
now that
opportunity, but
Marvel
whatever.
has the rights to those characters again, they can bring him back if they want to.
Well, yeah, because you have Quicksilver in the X-Men universe. The question is how much? None of the actors are folding over. We know that. None of
but
the
the
actors, but how many of the characters are going to fold over?
The reason
Which
that they-
I would be interested if they did fold X-Men Quicksilver in, and you've got Pietro and you've got Wanda and.
Well, the other Wonder was in a psych ward, so we'll figure that one out. So another thing that
No,
Marvel,
because mom sends the little sister upstairs to play with Wanda when they go to talk to Quicksilver in the basement.
Oh, okay. I've read somewhere that they
it's a
explain
very
her away as being
it's a very brief.
Crazy.
You miss it if you don't pay
Messi,
attention.
Vicky Blink. Okay.
Maybe we'll rewatch it. I could be wrong, but I seem to
We'll
remember
watch
that.
it. Another unique solution, and this is like the big cumulative thing that has gained prominence since 2015, about when I think Marvel created this idea, and it got some guffaws, and now it's kind of just spoken of with a backlash. But they came up with what they call the sliding timeline. The Marvel sliding timeline, and Google it, whatever. Basically, was this idea that they had that time progresses differently within the comic book world. That that roughly,
Which is really obvious.
which is obvious. But every roughly 4 to 5 years in
Real
our
time.
world will be like a year
Ish.
in their world ish. Which means that with all of the Christmas episodes and birthday issues and whatever, they have Christmas 5 times a year, and they have it's kind of odd.
Right, but go ahead. Sorry.
No.
Okay, but you don't have just the sliding timeline, because we were talking about this. There's the sliding timeline, and then there is the compression of time. Mm-hmm. So the sliding timeline, like you said, 4 to 5 years equals a year-ish. Mm-hmm. But then you've got the compression timeline, and the great example that we were looking at is Civil War and Secret Invasion. Mm-hmm. They happen almost back to back in the actual comic books. But by the time Secret Invasion comes around, they talk about Civil War in the books having happened about a year ago. Mm-hmm. So that's where your compression of time comes in. Of now we're not getting that 1 year in the 4 or 5 because these stories are back to back, but they're not back to back within the world.
Well, that a lot has to do also with the fact that these comic books are serial in nature, and the issues come out separate from each other, like months from each other. And while something is happening in one comic book at a faster pace than like one issue story, another comic book, the story is drawn out for 4 months, especially if they are the same character in multiple books. I know one of the things that Marvel did specifically to address this in the 90s was Marvel and DC both, they started doing weekly publications. They created enough issues or titles of their main characters or main groupings such that basically every week you had a new installment of that character, so that conceivably and frequently the story could be carried over weekly, and it would seem to feel like it would flow more naturally with real time. It was quite a it kind of contributed to the boom and the fall of the 90s comic book sales, because you had a lot of retailers who thought it was just okay, well, you know, Marvel and DC are just doing everything they can to milk their fans for as much as they can, which was also probably kind of true too.
Right. But that's where you get stories like the original for DC 52. It was a story every week that overall had a continuous arch, and one book every week, 52 weeks a year. And so they did that twice, didn't they? Before the whole new 52.
At least twice that I'm aware of.
But then Marvel was doing some of the same things, Spider-Man being one of the easier examples to look at, because you had the Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man,
Web of Spider-Man,
and as you like to call it, adjectiveless Spider-Man.
Yes.
It was just Spider-Man.
Just Spider-Man.
If they did New 52 twice, it's technically going to be
No, it wasn't
New
new.
104.
Right. It wasn't New 52. No,
wait.
So originally,
I think did the math right.
originally there was a series called 52, which just meant 52 weeks, because there's 52 weeks in a year. So, this is very confusing, because for some reason DC likes this number. The original...
They really do.
The original 52 was only meant to be 52 weeks in a year, and so this story was weekly, would take place over 52 weeks, and thus they called it 52. Now, when they launched their new universe, they also called it the New 52 because they had cut down the number of different issues that they published to only 52 titles. Why they picked that number, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that was how many titles that they were going to, and that didn't really last long anyway, and I don't even know, it was like a year before the New 52 was like 70-something titles.
Well, at one point they were talking about canceling titles to start other titles so they could keep the 52, but then, they're going, no, these titles are too popular, we're going to keep them.
Yeah, that doesn't really relate to timelines. So anyway, some of the confusing timeline stuff to use as a newer reader.
As a newer reader, would be, because I started getting back in when we first met, would be at the shop at the hospital. So that's when I started getting back into it, and then jumping in, I think, middle of New 52, and kind of reading around there and trying to catch up with every...
So was
that's why I'm a little salty.
So to you, was that successful? Did it work? Did you enjoy it?
Not necessarily. I think until Dark Side War picked up, that's when I started to really get a bit more into it, and I got a bit more familiar with Wally. I started reading a bit more Green Lantern series, because that's kind of what I go for. I love the... Yes. I love the kind of space stuff. So I kind of leaned a bit more towards that during when that run was going on, but slowly started moving off of comics onto TV shows and things like that.
So Dark Side War was definitely when I was falling off DC. You were saying earlier, was that kind of a soft reboot too, or?
I would say yes. Yeah, I would say it was a little of a soft reboot because they wanted to do other stuff, and then you also have what's going on now with, I think it's wrapping up Dark Knight's Metal.
Oh yeah,
things like that. So
yeah, well, one day we're gonna do a whole day just devoted to crossovers and such as that.
No,
it's gonna be 52 weeks long.
I'm waiting until we get
52 minutes.
Right.
I will make it a 52-minute episode.
No, when we do the time travel episode, there will be a flowchart of the Summers family tree, because that alone, look it up.
And the Richards, and how many different Nathans and
No, the most confusing family tree in all of Marveldom is the Summers family tree.
Oh yeah, they have at least 3 children from a universe that doesn't exist anymore. Back to time. in comic books. One of the things I find interesting is relating to things that happened or didn't have in continuity. For instance, one of the main things that once they started figuring this out, Marvel starts creating their sliding timeline. In the 90s, both publishers just stopped referencing anything that had happened before anyway. One of the key ways of noticing this is, I was saying, the president of the United States, there was a point in time when, like I said, they weren't really concerned with time moving forward, so they actually call Richard Nixon out by name. He appears in comic books, it's like the president, whatever. And then it gets to the 80s where the president vaguely looks Reagan-ish, but they never actually say, so you could always plausible deniability until it gets to the point where we get to, they just like go off book and make the president look like an amalgamation of something or nobody at all, That's one of the more fun things too. You are, as a newer reader, this is one of the reasons I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Do you find that, again, the publisher's whole reason for doing the reboots and everything is to free it up from continuity? And the whole argument is that, well, continuity is one of the best parts of it. Which do you prefer? Do you prefer not being bogged down by all that history and all that time and starting fresh? Or do you wish you had some of that history and some of that and been on the inside of some of that if it was still part of it? Because I know that's one of the things that they're doing with Rebirth is they're kind of just bringing that back. They're trying to... Again, DC is trying to have their cake and eat it too, and you can kind of not blame them, but...
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm a bit half and half. I don't mind having that kind of rich history, especially, let's say, if I'm reading a Green Lantern story or a Batman story, they reference in passing the JLA, if they reference Alan Scott, some of the older characters, Wildcat and things like that, some of the older leaguers. But at the same time, I don't mind that fresh take. I don't mind either when a new character comes in or when they revitalize something that was kind of iffy in like the 90s of the comics of a certain character, and I'm like, I'm glad they redid that and made it fresh, and it's just like, cool, you're not as sketchy as you were. Well, now you're kind of a bit more human. Yeah.
And that's kind of where the other medium takes off. Spider-Man specifically, personally, I prefer Peter Parker as a college student. He was always a college student as long as I've ever read comics. He was literally only a teenager for like 30 issues.
Well, okay. So
hold on, we're gonna run out of time if we go over that. But yeah, I'll make a comment about that. But now it looks like there might even be I was actually kind of hopeful. I'm like, oh crap, we're rebooting Spider-Man again, and they're starting him as a teenager again. But at least I like this teenager, and it's in the MCU, and MCU is going to let everybody age, right? So I was actually looking forward to Tom Holland becoming a college student. And now we might not get that either. So
way to go.
Yeah, another Spider-Man reboot is like really not what we need. So that's a whole other thing. But we were saying, Peter Parker in the comic book, technically he was 15 when he got his powers, and they said that, but he was only a few issues later that he graduated and went to college. But if you go by Marvel's timeline, that meant he would have had to have graduated at like 16 if he was a genius, and
genius, it's completely possible.
Not at that time. That's going to be what we have for today. Do what? Yeah, I know. But thank you for joining us. We hope we cleared some of it up, and you had some fun along this long journey of comic book history, because, we're going to come back to that. We probably just made it even more confusing, but, if it got you interested in some good stories, then, hey, we did something fun. Get with me on my page, Brad's Red Web, Brad's_Red_Web on Facebook, or Brad's Red Web on Instagram, and give us some feedback. Tell us what you thought. Let us know if there's anything you want to know more about or want to see in the future, and we really appreciate you watching. Thank you again, Martin, Bo, and we had a fun time, and we'll see you next time.
Appreciate you guys.